In this amazing conversation with author and entrepreneur Todd Cherches, we talk about the process of what it was like to write my book, The Influential Voice, Saying What You Mean for Lasting Legacy. I can't wait to hear what you think. Enjoy.
Tricia and I have a lot in common. We both live in New York. We both work or worked in the entertainment industry. Both of our books are published by the same publisher. We just found out, Post Hill Press, Simon & Schuster. And we're both members of Marshall Goldsmith's MG100 coaching group. So just one thing real quick is that most people think because I teach leadership that I majored in business, but I'm actually an English literature major with a concentration in Shakespeare. And Shakespeare famously wrote that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. And there's no one who's covered more stages that I've ever met than Tricia Brouk. She has starred on the dance stage, theater, Hollywood, independent film, documentaries, TEDx, and everything else that you've done. So Tricia is just an amazing public speaker on big stages, but also in the world. So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is how you can have a more influential voice. So Tricia's going to tell us how a young girl from a farm in Missouri ends up a New York star and a celebrity among those of us who are follow people in the public speaking realm. Tricia's one of the best I've ever seen. So the first question I want to start off with, and I just read Tricia's book over the last couple of days. It literally just got here yesterday. I started reading the PDF, and I read an average of one. You can see all the business books behind me. I read an average of one business book a week, and I've been doing that since 1998, so 22 years. So if you do the math, and I was not a math major, I was an English major, but it works out to over 1,000 business books. Most of them go up on the shelf, and I never look at them again. Tricia's book, and I can say this honestly, is going to be one of the ones I keep facing the front and go to going forward, because there's so much in there. It is not only a book on influence and public speaking, but it is a leadership book in many ways. It's a self-help book in many ways, and it's going to be a go-to resource that I'm going to recommend to everyone going forward. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce Tricia Brouk tonight. So I have my first two questions for you are, why did you write this book? And how the heck did you get a book deal in 2 days? So let's start with that, Tricia.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Todd. I want to just start by saying what an incredible introduction. Maddie, thank you so much. New York Public Library, thank you so much for having me with the CEO series. It's truly a privilege to be speaking from my hometown, New York City. It's now my hometown because I've been here for over 30 years. And Todd, I so appreciate you pointing out everything that we have in common, because our mission is truly in alignment, and being able to be interviewed by you today is such a privilege. And I have fond memories of us sitting at Argo Tea having a conversation after we were introduced by Michael Roderick, who was my first mentor. So full circle, here we are. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for that amazing introduction. Sure. Why did I write this book, and how did I get a book deal in 2 days? Such great questions, and they are related. So I'm glad that you put them back to back. The reason that I wrote this book was because I had been asked to write a book on public speaking. And for several months, I was shopping around my book proposal on public speaking and was getting zero response. And I was very concerned that the reason I was getting zero response is because I didn't really want to write a book about public speaking, but I wasn't honest with myself. I was kind of, sure, I'll write a book about public speaking. Was not passionate about it, didn't really care about it. There's a million books on public speaking and a million really good books on public speaking. So what I realized when Ahmaud Arbery's murder came out and Breonna Taylor was murdered and George Floyd was murdered and the first impeachment hearings were going on, I realized that I actually wanted to write a book on how to be an effective communicator and how to learn how to communicate with dignity, respect, love. And that is why I sat down to write the first chapter of The Influential Voice, which is all about the systemic racism in this country and how we need to learn how to communicate better and how to have our voices come to the forefront and to understand the power of language for good or for evil. And that's when I wrote chapter 1. Had a conversation with Anthony over at Post Hill Press, And he gave me a book deal in 2 days based on the chapter that I wrote. And that's because I wrote it from a place of absolute heart, vulnerability, and truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really how this all went down.
That's great. Yeah, one of the things I always talk about from a leadership perspective is the 2 P's, passion and purpose, right? So you had a passion for this topic and you had a purpose for writing it. So what would you say is what made you so passionate about this topic, and what is your purpose? What's your why, and what do you want people to get out of this book?
My purpose is to amplify and elevate voices in order to make the world a better place. Inclusion has been part of my core values from the beginning. That's not a new topic for me. Community, inclusion, diversity, respect, dignity, excellence, compassion, reliability, and love, that's all part of who I am and who my company is. So when I determined that I had a responsibility and an opportunity to actually put my values in alignment with my purpose and teach the art of communication and public speaking, everything came together and was completely aligned.
Yeah. Everyone's familiar, most people are familiar with Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. What most people don't know is his book, The 8th Habit, which is, do you know what the 8th habit is? His 8th habit is find your voice and inspire others to find theirs. And that's exactly what you do. So while he talks about it, and it was written many years ago, your book is so current, and it relates to social movements. It relates to COVID. It relates to everything that we're experiencing. So tie your theme into what's going on in the world today, and what can we take from it, like right now, to help make the world a better place and help to make ourselves better and give us a voice.
I think what's going on right now is everyone is afraid to use their voice because they don't know how necessarily. So I'm very, very clear that when you choose to be courageous, curious, and you come to this conversation with humility, you can't get it wrong. And that's something that I encourage everybody to really hear tonight. Courage, curiosity, and humility is going to get you into the conversation that is complicated. It's going to get you into the conversation about race. It's going to get you into the conversation about allyship. It's going to get you into the conversation about how I'm part of the problem and how I can be part of the solution. And that is really an opportunity for change and growth that we have right now. Stop Asian hate. Black Lives Matter. We need to come together and talk about all of this, because everybody, it's not going away. Our country is based on a system of racism, and we need to acknowledge that and have conversations about it, and be willing to make a mistake, be willing to be flawed, and be willing to step forward into your role as an influential voice, which is having courage, curiosity, and humility.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in my leadership classes at NYU in Columbia is I start the class by saying, just for curiosity, how many people here are leaders? And like no one raises their hand. And then what I say is, by the end of tonight, the first session, I'm going to ask the same question again, and everyone's going to be raising their hand, because we're going to redefine what it means to be a leader. And my personal mission statement in life and in my career is making the world a better place, one leader at a time. And to me, everyone is a leader, right? It's not a title or position. Even if you're just leading your own life, you're a leader. And to be a leader, you need to have influence. And to have influence, you have to have a voice, right? So build on that.
And being a leader and having an influential voice means at home, across the table from your kids, at home, across the table from your roommate, from your partner, from your spouse. It means in a classroom in front of your students. It means in a boardroom across the table from your colleagues. We have an opportunity to step in the role of leader and influential voice in everything that we're doing. And I share with you a story. March 2020, New York City, total chaos, uncertainty. It started here, it went everywhere. And in New York City, grocery stores were a little bit of a stressful situation. A couple blocks down from 55th and 9th, there's a grocery store that decided to be open 24/7 so that people could come in when it wasn't crowded. So I got up at 5:30, I went to the grocery store, and Pamela, in her beautiful mask and her gorgeous lashes and her fully done hair at 5:30 in the morning, always said hello to me. She always made me feel safe. She will forever be an influential voice in my life, because during that time of absolute stress and panic and fear and chaos, she influenced me by being kind and by talking to me in the morning when I got my groceries. That is what I'm talking about. She will forever be an influential voice in my life. So no matter what you do, no matter where you are, you have the opportunity to step in the role of influential voice and leader.
Yeah, and that had nothing to do with her title or her position or her status. It had to do with her person, right? Who she was and how you treat people. One of the things I write about in my book is my 3 V's are visibility, voice, and value. Visibility is about, are you seen and how are you seen? Voice is, are you heard and how are you heard? And value is about, are you making a contribution? So how would you relate what you're talking about to my 3 V's, which is, I kind of use that in a lot of ways to encourage people to turn their cameras and mics on when we're on a Zoom call, or to speak up and speak out in public. So what do those 3 V's mean to you?
Value, voice, and what, Todd?
Visibility, value, voice, and value. So being seen, being heard, and making a contribution.
We are in a world of visibility right now, and it's your responsibility to be conscious that when you are on social media, when you are outside and someone else has their camera up, you are visible, which means your role of being an influential voice is always on. And when you choose to step into the role of leader or influential voice, and you are conscious of being visible, it means being very aware of how you're communicating, the words you choose, and how you're showing up, and making sure that you are showing up consistently at all time. Voice is really giving yourself permission to trust that what you have to say matters. There are 7.8 billion people on the planet. One of them is meant to hear what you are supposed to say. And if you're lucky, maybe 2. But that one person, you could potentially change and even save their life. And value is all about, first, aligning your mission and your influential voice with your values. Because if and when you veer off track, if you come back to your values, you will be course corrected right away. The other part of value that I want to highlight is, as an influential voice, as a leader, it is your responsibility to provide value. As a speaker, it is never about you. As an influential voice, it is not about you. It is about the value that you are providing. It's about the service that you are in. And that's why value, voice, and visibility are so amazing. Thank you for sharing that from your book.
And you did great on that question. That was a pop question that we didn't even prepare for. So I threw it at you, and you handled that great. So one of the things that you mentioned, you just mentioned the word responsibility, and in the movie Spider-Man and in the comic book Spider-Man, there's that famous quote, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And we're not talking about power, again, as a title, it's the power we have, the power within. So can you talk about responsibility in the context of the 4 categories I love from your book: credibility, relatability, vulnerability, and responsibility?
If we start with credibility, I want to share that being an influential voice does not mean you have to have a PhD next to your name or you have to be a published author. It means that you're the credible expert talking about the subject matter that you know to be true. Relatability is the performance quality. It is that you are open, making eye contact, able for your audience to lean into you because you're communicating in a way that is human and authentic. And then vulnerability is about being really personal without being, without making anyone feel like they need to take care of you. Vulnerable means you are ready to share that personal story, that trauma, that tragedy without any kind of residual pain. You must be healed from that trauma. You must speak, and this is not new, you must speak from the scar, not the wound. And then if we go into responsibility, and I share some stats with you that the China virus was used more than 20 times from the White House early in March of 2020. And in June of 2020, Kung Flu flooded Twitter. Now, this is the responsibility I'm talking about. You have a major responsibility as an influential voice to be conscious of the words you are choosing and how you're using them. We are in a very, very difficult time right now in history. Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are being, racism and hate crimes against them has gone up. There are over 3,800 increased hate crimes against Asian Americans in the last year. And I say this because the responsibility from the top was not considered when those word choices were used. So I ask everyone to think about what it means to be responsible when you're speaking. Choose your words wisely. Be conscious of microaggressions. And if you hear someone else using a microaggression out of ignorance, ask them if they're aware of it. Ask them permission if you may ask, then ask them if they're aware, and then have a conversation about what could be a better word choice. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to responsibility. Our words have impact on people. As leaders, as influential voices, people are going to behave and respond a certain way because we are influential voices. And that comes with, like you said, Todd, great responsibility.
Can you share the story about the incident on the subway from your book with the kids who were saying stuff that was basically speech violence in a way?
Yes, absolutely. I had the privilege of seeing Michelle Obama in her Becoming tour at the Barclays Center in 2019. I left at 10 o'clock. It had just ended and I zipped onto the subway. It was summer, so it wasn't really that dark yet either in New York City. The subway was full. I was going back to Manhattan, and in the left-hand corner of the subway, of the train, there were 5 young white boys, and they were dressed really well, and they were a little rambunctious, and then they began talking inappropriately about a classmate, a female classmate. And it was audible to me, and I was sitting pretty far away from them, mid-train. They were on the edge of the train. And I thought, oh, do I say something? Do I stay silent? This is so inappropriate. And I in a moment thought, I'm an influential voice and it's my responsibility to stand up. I was safe. The train was crowded. I walked over, and not in a loud voice so everyone on the train could hear me, in enough so that those 5 boys could hear me. And I said, excuse me, you are speaking violence against the classmate that you're referring to, which means you're speaking violence against me, and you're speaking violence against every other woman and girl on this train. Please stop. And they made fun of me. And I said, please stop. And they stopped. And I went back down and sat down, and no one bothered me. No one said anything. Everyone was silent because I didn't make a huge deal out of it. And the reason that I did that, Todd, is because it was my hope that one of those 5 boys in the future would potentially say, hey guys, this isn't cool. It was my hope that my behavior and my influence on one of those 5, maybe 2 of those 5 boys, would potentially ask them to think differently so that they would stop the behavior of speech violence. Thank you for asking me about that.
Yeah. I was talking about two eyes, impact and influence, right? So your words have impact on people and also influence. So as you think about who are the people whose words impact you and who are the people who try to influence you, who are the people who are influenced by your words and actions and impacted as well. I'm just reminded of the quote from Dale Carnegie, who said that the words we say to someone, we may forget 2 seconds later, but may linger with the other person for the rest of their lives. And that could be negative words or positive words, right? So I'm sure you had some impact on those kids when I'm sure they like laughed it off or whatever at the time, but hopefully in the privacy of, late, they're thinking about it. And the next time, maybe they won't do that, or they'll be more conscious about the impact of our language. Because, so like we say, if we don't speak up, we're basically condoning what's going on, right? If we don't say something.
Our silence is definitely part of the problem. And that's where I go back to courage, curiosity, and humility. If you implore those 3 characters, you can't get it wrong.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about one of the topics in your book is this number related to fear and anxiety, and some people submitted questions in advance, limiting beliefs, and one of the catchphrases that's out there now is imposter syndrome. What do you do when you feel like, who am I to be speaking up and speaking out? Who am I to have a voice? What do you say to people who feel that they haven't been empowered to do that? How do they find that power within them to have that influential voice?
What I like to say about this, Todd, is who am I to speak out? Who am I to share my story? When you limit yourself from sharing your powerful story and from sharing your point of view with the world, you are actually preventing that one person from hearing from you. And that means you're being selfish. If you are preventing that one person from hearing from you so that they can relate to you and to your credibility and to your vulnerability, and they could potentially step into the role of being responsible, you are then serving. If you don't share your message, if you allow that imposter syndrome or who am I, why should I, there's a million other people who can, you're preventing that one person from hearing your message. And that is selfish. If you are afraid that what you have to say doesn't matter, if you are afraid that your voice doesn't matter and that someone else should be saying it, I say this with love, you're wrong. You are the one person who needs to say it because there's no other you. You are the unique person who can share this idea through your point of view. There aren't any new ideas, everybody, and we're all talking about COVID right now. However, all of the human beings on this planet have had a different and a unique experience with the pandemic. So even though it's the same idea, it's a unique way of expressing it. So I definitely believe that, yes, you must speak out. Your voice matters. And there is one person at least who is meant to hear from you.
Great. So even though I talk loud and fast because I'm a New Yorker, in fact, my wife gave me the seashell to keep on my desk. It represents a snail shell to remind me to slow down and not talk so fast. So I have it here as a visible reminder. But even though I talk loud and fast, I am an introvert, an extreme introvert. I always describe myself as a 3Bs guy, a back of the room, behind the scenes bookworm. That's my default. So anything I do beyond that is pushing myself way out of my comfort zone, including doing TEDx talks and teaching at NYU and Columbia. It's way out of my comfort zone and beyond anything I ever would have envisioned myself doing 10 or 15 years ago. So what's your message for introverts? How do we have the courage and confidence to speak up and speak out as opposed to stepping back and saying, yeah, we'll let the extroverts take this one?
This comes down to how you're going to show up in a rehearsal process. If you are terrified of getting on stage, if you're super shy, if you are an introvert, like my amazing client, James Lucas, who was in the speaker salon, who is a vegan, who does not wear animal products. He does not eat animal products, and he does not go to entertainment or watch any television that has animals in it. He is a hardcore vegan. The thing that I shared with him is, you need to be the voice of the animals. They can't tell their story. And that helped him move from terrified to potentially more comfortable. The one thing that really changed everything for him was giving him something to do. And this is something that good directors do with actors all the time. If a scene's not working, if an actor's not dropping into the scene, or they're schmacting, they're doing their thing, give them something to do so that they can get out of their head. And that's exactly what I did with James Lucas at the speaker salon. I put a bunch of brooms, a bunch of mops, some music stands, some garbage, all this stuff onto the stage. And I asked him to deliver his talk while he cleaned up the stage. Everything else went away because he had something to do. And he literally delivered the best performance I've ever seen him deliver because he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about his tasks. So give yourself something to do in the rehearsal process so that you can move beyond that fear. And you can also teach yourself that you actually have the confidence and the skill set to do it. And then that confidence competence loop starts building. And when you get yourself in front of people, you are reminded physiologically that you won't die, that you won't pass out, that you won't faint when you begin speaking.
Yeah, that's great. Can we take, I'm going to hit the pause button for a second and go back to, like, how did you get to this point? Give us a little bit of I love an origin story. I love word origins, and I love how things got to be where they are. So talk about how you went from being a dancer and a pageant young girl to, you know, doing what you're doing and being the subject of a documentary. And I can't wait to see that when it comes out. So give us the quick Trisha Brooks bio.
All right. I grew up on a farm in Arnold, Missouri, and decided I was going to move to New York City to become a dancer when I saw my sister on stage dressed as a pink poodle doing shuffle ball changes. I became obsessed with Baryshnikov and Gelsey Kirkland, was watching PBS all the time, had my feet underneath the doors so that I could create beautiful arches so I could become a ballerina, went to school for dance, and then moved to New York City at the age of 20 to pursue my career in dance. Had a very successful modern dance career, danced all over the world, including the Paris Opera, Vienna Opera House, Palermo Opera House, BAM Opera Theater, Lincoln Center in New York City. And moved from being a dancer to the other side of the table as a producer, director, writer, choreographer. And 3 years ago, a dear friend of mine, Petra Kolber, reached out and said, I just landed at TEDx Syracuse University, and I want you to direct me. And I thought, I love TED Talks. It'll be like a one-woman show. So we did script analysis, we did blocking and choreography, we did intention and acting skills. And that was all. I didn't think anything of it. And she planted the seed that I should do this. I had no idea that there was a thing called public speaking that people needed rehearsal for. And I didn't realize that there were so many incredible thought leaders who wanted to amplify and elevate their voices. So I stepped into the role of amplifying and elevating people's voices and had all these speakers show up out of nowhere with no place to put them. And as a theater producer, what do? You produce shows. What's the best show for speakers? TEDx. So I became the executive producer of TEDx Lincoln Square. I performed that show in New York City for 2 years, decided to move on so I could have more creative control, produced a show called Speakers Who Dare with Jamie Broderick. And we had our final Speakers Who Dare in March of 2020. We made it virtual and it was amazing. And now my new virtual show is going to, my new live show is going to be the Big Talk Live, and that's coming. It really was about being able to have the ripple effect of supporting amazing leaders and having their voice reach more and more people. And that is where I realized my lasting legacy was supporting amazing speakers.
That's great. I said, one of the central themes to me is storytelling, right? It's like telling story through dance, telling story through each of the mediums that you described. And I mentioned before, one of my favorite sentences of your book that really jumped out at me on page 33 was step into the power of your voice. So what does that mean in all of these different contexts? How is that like a unifying catchphrase for you?
As a former dancer, voice means many things. I was on stage for many, many years without speaking a word. And the way I expressed myself and my voice was through my body, through my choreography. And I knew how to captivate an audience the second I walked out onto that stage. And I never said a word. And I say this because you can become an influential voice by how you show up in the world, by the energy that you're giving off, by the gratitude that you have every day for your life and for those around you. It doesn't mean you have to be on stage orating. It means you have to show up every single day with impact. And that means saying hello to people on the street. It means making eye contact. It means being a great human being, not a good human being, a great human being. We have one life. And if you are thinking about being of service at all times, which means being kind and curious and respectful and speaking with dignity, you truly are stepping into having a voice.
That's great. That's great. So one of the things that, as I was capturing some of the key words that you mentioned today and from your book, empathy and understanding jumped out at me, diversity and inclusion, impact and influence, amplify and elevate. I love that. Vulnerability and transformation. Can you talk a little bit more about vulnerability? You mentioned it before, but it's for a lot of people, it's scary to be vulnerable, to speak up and speak out. And one of the things I love about your book, in addition, I said, it's not only a book on influencing and voice, it's a leadership book, because when you talk about leaders need to have credibility to build trust. You need to relate to people. You need to be vulnerable, right? And admit that you don't have all the answers. And you have a responsibility to not only be a voice for your people, but to listen to your people. So can you talk a little bit about listening? Because how does listening, we're talking about speaking, but how does listening factor in?
I love that you are highlighting this, Todd. Listening is the first thing when it comes to being an influential voice. It is not about volume. It is not about quantity. It's about listening and quality. And that means going back to curiosity. If you are observing what's happening and you are really listening, then you're giving yourself the opportunity to respond accordingly. So many people aren't listening to anything anyone is saying, and they're just bombarding us with what they think they need to say in order to elevate themselves or to puff themselves up. If you really hold back and just take a minute to listen to what's happening, and then you can respond accordingly. You don't need to say a lot. because you've observed what's happening by having excellent listening skills, and you can then share your thoughts succinctly for impact. And I think that's something that makes this very unique, is that there's so many people who are blah, 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 blahing. And it's going on and on and on. And they just love hear. And I'm experiencing this on Clubhouse. Let's be real.
Yeah.
And so if you are just taking a second and listening and giving yourself the opportunity to observe and to form and formulate those thoughts, and then when you deliver that succinct, thoughtful message, that is the kind of impact that people are going to remember.
One of the things that we want to listen to is our inner voice, right? And some of the, talk a little bit about stories and storytelling. And when people ask questions, like I keep a journal. I started keeping a journal my first day of freshman year of college. I'll say what year. It was 1980, September 1980. That's how old I am. And I have not missed a day since. So I'm on journal number 41. And I jot down not only what I did that day and what I had for lunch, but questions, thoughts, ideas, fears, whatever. So when I sat down to write my book, my journal was an amazing resource because I captured so many of those stories, as opposed to facing a blank page and saying, what should I write? How do people find their own stories and feel like I have stories to tell and stories to share? So talk a little bit about storytelling.
I think the first thing is to realize that mundane activity makes for good story. You don't have to be, climbing a mountain. You don't have to be swimming in the sea in order to have an amazing story. If you think about the beautiful details of every single part of your life, that makes you unique. And that kind of storytelling is what we relate to. We're not talking about being on the red carpet and winning an Oscar. We're talking about how hard it is to get up every morning some days, because life is not easy. We're talking, and that's what makes you relatable. And that's what makes you a good leader, because how do we communicate the difficulty of the mundane? I never said that before. I'm
great.
just thinking of that for the first time.
Well, now it's on recording, and now you can listen to that.
The difficulty of the mundane.
With storytelling, I do a workshop on visual storytelling for leaders, and I was doing one for a group of CEOs, and this one CEO said, I hate storytelling, I'm terrible at storytelling. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he went on to tell this great story about how much he hates storytelling. So it's like, children tell stories, grandparents tell stories, cavemen told stories on cave drawings 44,000 years ago. So we're just wired for story, right? So I think a lot of people have that limiting belief of, I'm not a good storyteller, or I have nothing interesting to say. I love the quote from Bill Nye, the science guy, who said that everyone that you will ever meet knows something that you don't, right? Because no one has lived your life. So when I'm talking to my students in my class, I may have a 25-year-old female student from Beijing who says, I haven't lived that long, I haven't worked. But yet I've never been a 25-year-old female from Beijing. Tell me your story. Teach me something that I don't know, right? So again, if we just reframe it, talk about reframing. How do we context and reframing? What do those mean? Because you write about that in your book.
Well, context is really important if you want to have global impact. And that is specific to one of my very first speakers, and I'll share that story. But context is asking the three questions: why does this matter? Why does it matter to me? And why does it matter to the world? And you can use these three questions when it comes to writing a book, writing a talk, blog post, having a conversation like this. Like, okay, how am I showing up today? Why does this conversation with Todd matter? Why does it matter to me? And why does it matter to the world? And this is a specific example. Kristen Smedley, who's an amazing speaker, she was my very first TEDx Lincoln Square speaker. And she came to me and she said, I want to do a TED Talk. I was not yet the organizer of TEDx Lincoln Square. And I said, great, let's start working on it, and the universe will provide. We had our first active listening session, and she said, I want to do a talk about rare eye disease. I have 3 children, 2 were born blind. And I started a foundation 16 years ago when my first son was born blind, about rare eye disease. And I thought, okay, that's amazing. Let's have this conversation. Let me do some listening. And by the end of the conversation, I realized this talk is not about rare eye disease. And I said, Kristen, this talk is about how you learn to see the world differently through the eyes of your children. And that completely reframed how she thought about her idea. And that's because we asked the 3 questions. Why is this idea important? Awareness around rare eye disease. Why is it important to Kristen? Because she has 2 blind kids. But why is it important to the world is a question I want you to ask yourself whenever you're writing anything or having a conversation about anything. The reason that we answered the question is because I don't have kids and I don't have blind kids. So if she's going to limit this idea to her 2 blind children, I'm going to tune out. But if she opens up the idea to how she learned to see the world through the eyes of her children, I, as a woman who have no children or blind children, can think about seeing the world through the eyes of others to create compassion and empathy. And now her big idea relates to me, and that's global impact.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Yeah, because we need to take our own small stories, the micro stories, and magnify them to the macro world and make them universal. You know, our humanity is what unites us, right? So anything that we experience, other people can relate to if we reframe it in a context that they will understand. Let's a couple of questions. Let's start with one from Sean. We are all wired to hear stories. How do you wire yourself to tell stories? So it's hearing stories, but yeah, how do you get in the habit of doing it? Like anything, I assume once you start doing it and you get better at it, like any skill, right? So we need to start somewhere.
Well, I think we can identify the word habit with the word rehearsal. And if you begin to tell a story and it's not going well, and I'm not suggesting you go to the big stage and start telling your story for the very first time. You need to practice, you need to rehearse. It's important that you get the skills of what it means to be a storyteller so that you can step in front of people and have impact. If you are not prepared as a storyteller and you've never rehearsed, you've never practiced of what your body's going to physiologically betray you when you get on stage. So not only do you need to have the content rehearsed, you need to have the physical response rehearsed. So if we start with content first, that means doing this material over and over again. Many people fight me on memorization, and I will continue to stand by the art of memorization, because if you are memorized, guess what? You move into freedom. If you are always working from bullets, you cannot guarantee you are going to make sure you hit everything every time, because things are going to pop up in your head. Somebody's going to move. You're going to get distracted. But if you're memorized beyond the point of having it in your DNA, then you are in a playground. Then, of course, once you're memorized and you have all that rehearsal under your belt in terms of great storytelling, you also have to rehearse what happens when your palms sweat, when your knees shake, when your hands are shaking. Your body is going to physiologically betray you when you get in front of other human beings. It's just going to happen. No matter how many stages you've been on. I've been on thousands of stages alone in huge opera houses, and I still get nervous. Yeah. And that is because I care. That's because I'm excited. That's because I want to do my best. And I also rehearse in front of people, even now, so that I know that if someone's watching me and I have to stay accountable to finish that talk and not apologize, not make an excuse, not, oh, I don't need to rehearse. No, you must rehearse in front of people so that you can practice what's going to happen under mild stress, which means the words are going to fly out of your mind, which means you're going to forget. Your mouth is going to get dry. You're going to start shaking, and you might even start swaying uncontrollably. Yeah. Memorize and rehearse under mild pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have so much to say on this topic. One of them is so often when people memorize a script, they could come across as robotic and wouldn't, right? I've seen that a lot of times, like they're trying to memorize and catch. That means they haven't prepared and practiced enough, right? It's like once you've done that, it's like you have you could take poetic license once you've learned the foundations of something and the rules of the game. So talk a little bit about how do you not be sound scripted and over rehearsed and robotic, still be natural and authentic, and yet, you know, so how do you balance that?
It means you're not memorized. If you are recalling instead of performing, you really actually don't have the words. And that is because you haven't done the work. You have to get past the point of believing you know the script. And I've seen this happen many times. Speakers think they've got it. They've got their page and they're like, I'm completely memorized. I just need to look down for that one word. I'm totally memorized. I just need a tiny cue. You're not memorized. You keep looking at the page. So don't lie to yourself, because if you are not fully memorized, you're going to exactly what you're saying. You're going to sound robotic, and it's not going to be conversational. You want to be so memorized and off book that you do not need to think about the script, and anything that happens in that audience is not going to throw you. anything that happens, because you know exactly what you want to say and how you're going to say it. And if somebody raises their hand and stands up and asks you a question in the middle of your talk, you're going to be able to answer them and then come right back to where you are, because you are so memorized that you own those words. You are in complete command of the content.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. One of the other questions someone asked is, how do you listen deeply without getting caught in forming a thought? So it's natural to like listen to respond as opposed to listen with empathy and listen for understanding. So it's like, how do we balance those two things? Because we want to have influence and we want to respond, but how just to answer Donna's question about that, how do we do that?
I think, great question, Donna. I think what I would suggest is giving yourself permission to not have to help the person right away. It is our nature to want to help. It's our nature to want to solve a problem. And many times people just want to be heard. And sure, those thoughts are going to come in. Oh, I know how to answer that question. I know how to solve this problem. They're not asking you in that moment to solve a problem. They're asking you to listen. So if you can give yourself permission to resist the desire to help until A, they ask, or B, it's appropriate, I think that's going to really serve you as an active listener.
That's great. The next one, an anonymous person asks, and this is kind of a complicated one, what is the source of your power at times of adversity? So the way I would interpret this is, how do you not get down with all of this negative stuff going on in the world? And how can we shift from individual agency to systemic change? So it's a broad question, but what are your thoughts on that?
Such a great question. The source of my power comes from my desire to make the world a better place in this very, very short time that I have on the planet. And I believe strongly in right and wrong. I believe strongly in allyship and solidarity. I believe strongly in using your voice for good. And whether I'm having personal adversity or the globe and the planet is having adversity, I think about waking up one day at a time, putting one foot in front of another. And I say this because most recently I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's so many things that we have to do. There's so many things that we have to give voice to. And that can be completely overwhelming. So one day at a time and one step at a time. And how can we shift from individual agency to systemic change is by having these conversations. It starts with one person at a time, and it starts with one community at a time. So by being an influential voice and having that conversation and trusting that the conversation I'm having with Peme at 5:30 in the morning at the grocery store could potentially impact her life and could potentially impact her life, or his life. And I'm sharing with you all today that she impacted my life. So that could potentially impact you, and you might share that story, and whoever you tell might tell that story. That is how we move from one to many.
That's great. I love it. My friend Brian Mattamore is on the call. He's on the session. He's an ideation specialist in innovation. He says two of the key elements or skills in facilitating successful ideation sessions are being willing to be self-effacing. So what can you say about being self-effacing? And two, be willing to laugh in the moment with the group. What about humor? Let's talk a little bit about humor, when and if appropriate. How do we incorporate humor when we're dealing with so many serious topics?
I think it's at first important to determine whether it's appropriate. And I think it's also important to be willing to be made fun of in the moment. And I say this because I was introduced in 2020, January of 2020, in San Diego on a stage at I Heart My Life by James Williams. Emily Williams and James Williams had an event, and I was one of the keynote speakers. And my introduction went like this: you're really going to be excited about this next speaker, Tricia Brouk. She's had massive sex. And everyone in the audience was like, what? And he became very red and said, I mean, massive success. And I walk out on stage, and it was one of the best introductions I've ever had, because I was able to say, hey, everybody, I'm so excited to be here. I can neither confirm nor deny I've had massive sex. And by acknowledging how silly that was and how fun it was, it made James feel easy. It made the audience feel easy. And it was the best way for me to start my conversation. So I think being able to play and to make fun and to not take everything so seriously is really important. I had a conversation last week with Elizabeth Wellington, a journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer. We did a piece together a couple weeks ago about race and hate. And I had her on my podcast. And one of the things that I wanted to ask her about, which she actually made me laugh when we were having a very, very serious discussion about race, is that why do we other? And then she said, I mean, I other the cyclists. Why are the bicyclists in my lane? I'm trying to walk on the sidewalk and I'm othering the bicyclists. And so it was that moment that she made fun of the fact that we other everything. And if it's the cyclist, if it's the Asian Americans, if it's the Black community, we need to be conscious of what we're doing. But what I loved is that she made a moment of seriousness a little bit more light. It has to be appropriate though.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah. Any tips for networking and talking about yourself from an anonymous questioner?
I would say when you're networking and when you're communicating about yourself, think about it in relationship to how you can serve the person you're communicating with. So it's not, again, talking at the person. It's about having an exchange, a dialogue, so that what you share is in service of them. I'm an award-winning director, and I would love to be able to talk with you about some documentaries that I recently watched on Netflix that I love. Do you have any interest in documentaries? So yeah, I shared a little bit about what I did, but I made it about how I could support the person I was communicating with.
That's great. One of the chapters, you'll appreciate this. One of the chapters in my book is called Why It's Better to Be Interested Than Interesting. And we were at a New Year's party, and there was an actor in the kitchen who cornered me and my wife. And he was like talking about how he's so perfect for all these parts and he's not getting any callbacks and this and that. He's like, I wish I could meet this one casting director who does more television in New York than anyone. And he kept going on about that. And he didn't ask us one question about ourselves. Now, and then he left. Nice to meet you. The casting director that he wanted to meet more than anyone else in the world, that's my college roommate. And we just had dinner with him like an hour before we got to this party. He had never asked us who we were or anything. And my wife's a casting director. So he never asked her, what do you do? Right. So it's totally, he was so self-obsessed and so trying to sell that he didn't take any. So yeah, that's Dale Carnegie 101, right? How to win friends and influence people is to show interest in the other person. So that to me is one of I love that story because it's like so visible and such a New York story, right? The New York actor who's like, why won't anyone call me back? It's like, because you're an egomaniac. Maybe that could be one of the reasons. What else? What are some questions? Let me ask you this question. Any other questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A box. But what's a question that we haven't asked yet that you would like to answer? What's something we haven't talked about yet that you would like people to know?
I think really that whether you are a teacher, a parent, CEO, a thought leader, a grocery store clerk, you have an influential voice. And I think when you really step into that role fully and trust and remove those limiting beliefs and believe wholeheartedly that whatever you have to say from your point of view, from your upbringing, from your everything, who makes you up, that is important. And that makes you an influential voice. And by holding back and by not sharing what you think to be true with the world, you're preventing the one person who's meant to hear it.
Great. What about we're living in a Zoom and social media world right now, and we'll go back to some in-person normalcy, hopefully sometime soon. What have you learned over the last year that's maybe changed your opinion, or some tips related to both navigating both the in-person world and the online world? Anything that jumped out at you?
The one thing that does jump out at me is that anybody thinks they can produce a virtual show. Anybody thinks they can have a Zoom interview and it's going to go great. And that's not true. You want to be able to produce a virtual showcase, a virtual interview, a virtual fireside chat, the same exact way and with the same exact care that you would if it was live and in person. There's something that is off about people thinking, oh, I can just hop onto Zoom and I don't have to do any preparation. I don't have to learn anything about the software. It'll just go perfectly. And that's not the case. If you want to be an influential voice and step into a level of excellence in this virtual world, learn the software. Learn how to produce a show that's actually going to give your audience something worthwhile. We have massive Zoom fatigue. Everybody's exhausted from sitting in their rooms by themselves, talking to a screen, communicating like this. And so it's really important that you do your best to have the right sound, the right lighting, to understand what the process is with the software so that you can create the best possible experience, because nobody has time to watch mediocre anything anymore. So I think it's really important, if you are going to continue to do virtual firesides, virtual experiences, because they're not going away, learn how to do it well so that you can really rise to the top.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we always talk about is people judge you based on what you say, how you say it, how you look, and how you act. So it's all of those things. So whether you're in person or online, people are filtering things through that lens. So let me just see the next question. What should you say if you know nothing about the other person and they happen to ask about you first? How do you know what's too much or too little, or what's appropriate when you're talking to someone that maybe you never met before and you don't know who they are?
I think it's really about being organic and really reading the energy. And if somebody asks you about you first, you can say a little bit and say, I'd love to know more about you. Tell me something about you. And then if they share something that it sparks an interest, or that is something in common, like we both live in New York City, we were introduced by a mutual friend, we have a million things to talk about that's going to give us an organic back and forth, Todd. And that's the thing that you're looking for, some sort of organic back and forth that's not transactional, but that is conversational.
Yeah, that's great. And another way to do it, one of my tips is, use social media. I never meet anyone before looking them up on LinkedIn and or Facebook, and find out. I met so many people recently who, we both went to SUNY Albany, or we both know these people, or find those points of commonality. And you can say, how do you know so-and-so? Here's a question that comes up, and this is related to what we were talking about before. I've done a lot of diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging related reading lately, because it's part of leadership and part of my teaching. Sometimes you can just say innocently to someone, so where are you from? And people might interpret that in a way that maybe it wasn't intended. So there's a lot of sensitivity. So how do we navigate that? Like, say, a lot of times we talk about impact and intention. So sometimes your intentions are good, but your impact is negative. So any tips for navigating that in the current climate?
I think, why don't we start with, how are you today? I'd love to hear how you're doing. Mm-hmm. And open up the dialogue with what's happening in the moment. Where are you from? What are you do could potentially activate a whole thing. And so being sensitive in the moment, getting a little bit more information before you go so personal. Where are you from? What do you do? I think could be a much more valuable into having that conversation. How are you today? Oh my gosh, nobody asked me how I'm doing. I'm really nervous that I'm here. I have no idea why I'm here. I have no idea what to say. Oh my gosh, me too. That's so funny. We both have that same experience. And then all of a sudden you're connected, you're vulnerable, you're related, and then a beautiful conversation could potentially be.
That's great. Yeah. One of my mantras when I teach team building workshops is that team bonding needs to come before team building, and that we need to connect to each other if we want to work better with each other, right? So what you're talking about is helps with the bonding and the connecting before you start working together, where it's about relationship building. It's about realizing, one of the things we talked about before is the rainbow eye on the cover of my book represents diversity and inclusion, and the fact that no one in the world sees the world through the same lens you do. No one has the same background, parents, upbringing, culture, experiences, whatever. So a lot of times from a leadership perspective, you think everyone sees the world the way you do, but no one does, because even twins, my father and uncle were twins, they saw the world in a different way, right? So we need to be sensitive to that. And one of my
let me just point out another thing we have in common, Todd. My grandfather and his brother were twins.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. And did they see the world eye to eye, or did they have different? Yeah. So that's one thing. So think about that rainbow eye and the fact that we all see the world through a different lens. And one of my other concepts is flipping the eye. Turn that eye on yourself and really look inwardly at your biases, your assumptions, your prejudices, your belief systems. Because one of the things I say about leadership is my concept of visual leadership is that who you are and how you lead is inseparable from the lens through which you see the world. Right? So your vision of the future and the decisions you make and the actions you take are all rooted in who you are and how you see things. But if we stop, hit the pause button, and realize that other people see it differently, it's not just about making your vision a reality, but how do I help other people make their vision a reality? So I think that's a big part. So talk about that in terms of, we're trying to have an influential voice. What can we do to help other people express their influential voice?
It comes back to listening. It comes back to being curious, asking questions, making sure that you see people and you make sure they feel seen and feel heard. That is how we help others have an influential voice. It means when you walk into a room and it's your team, you literally see each one of them for who they are and not this overarching theme of my team. You see them individually. It means that you are always talking about conversations and it's not transactional. And you want to enlist your team. You want to enlist everyone to think about what's important. And that's really about elevating and amplifying voices. It means making the people you are communicating with feel valued, feel seen, and feel heard. Even if it's across the table from your barista, even if it's across the table from your checkout clerk. And I have this experience. I went for a blowout yesterday for another event, and the woman at the salon, and I didn't know her. I just walked in, I needed a blowout, and she was in a bad mood. She was having a bad day. She was in a bad mood. And I thought, ooh, I have an opportunity to change her mind. And it was my mission to see her and to be kind to her. And by the end of our time together, she was so warm and playful and smiling. And that's what I'm talking about when it means, when I'm saying being an influential voice. It means observing your surroundings and making a decision to make a difference in someone else's life.
Yeah, in your book, you talk not only about changing people's lives, but actually saving people's lives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I make documentary films on people who are doing amazing things. And one of the documentary films that I made is called You're Gorgeous, I Love Your Shirt, an inside look at bullying and mental health. And I featured Tanya and Lindsay Harris. Lindsay Harris gave us permission to tell her story. She was bullied in school and had 2 suicide attempts. And her mom and Lindsay gave me this great privilege of being able to tell their story. And they came to New York and they went to see Dear Evan Hansen, which was also part of Lindsay's healing. And we did a screening of it in LA. And we're in the theater in LA. This movie's playing and there's a few people in the theater. It's a huge theater, so there weren't very many people compared to how many seats. But there were a handful. And we went out into the lobby, Lindsay and Tanya and I afterwards, and we were standing there just enjoying the fact that our film was screened in LA. And a stranger walked up to me and he said, I want to thank you. I've always been bullied as an adult. My wife and I are getting divorced and I was contemplating suicide. And tonight I've changed my mind. Wow. That is the power of telling your story. He watched our 12-minute short documentary about mental health, bullying, and suicide, and was inspired to make a different decision. So I take this very seriously when I say you have the opportunity to change and even save a life, which is why going back to responsibility is so important. You must be conscious of the responsibility of how you show up in the world.
That's an amazing story. It must make you feel amazing just to have that kind of impact through. I mean, that's the power of art, right? When people say, oh, art is just entertainment, it's so much more than that, right? It's life, right? Also, as you're talking, I was thinking about Seth Godin had a quote that said, you don't have to please everyone, you just have to please someone or satisfy someone, right? So it's like your story doesn't have to be one that everyone that needs to agree with or relate to, but if it's just that one person or that 2 people. So, I mean, that's why I teach for a living. That's why I'm an executive coach. It is making the world a better place, one person at a time. What about, someone asked about LinkedIn, but what about social media? How do we, I want to ask you 2 questions. One is for people who would like to someday take a big stage. What tips do you have, whether it's a TEDx talk or speakers who dare? So what are some tips for getting a public speaking engagement? But first, what about social media? How do we express our voice through social media these days?
I'm not a social media expert, but what I can say is if you want to be a public speaker, lead with you're a speaker and change your LinkedIn right now to speaker, author, teacher, whatever it is, but lead with speaker. And the other thing is to be consistent. If you are consistently showing up on all of your social media platforms and you are specifically obvious, I want to speak on big stages. I'm looking for stages to speak on. Anybody have any referrals to stages? I'm available. I'm looking to speak on TED stages. Be super obvious on social media platforms that is what you desire. And then before you know it, people are going to start sending you speaking engagements.
That's great. You have such a great checklist on page 96 of your book. I wish I had this years ago because it was, but now I have it. So better late than never. But so two things. One is I finally got a TEDx talk, TEDx Chelsea Park in New York in 2019, but I had been rejected 4 times before I finally got it. So don't take the first time as a failure or give up. It's like a lot of times you talk a lot about your application and your, in fact, you critiqued one of mine once. It was like 18 pages long, right? I think that was ripped it apart. But so talk about like, how do you capture your idea worth spreading is the TEDx line, right? So it's like, how do you come up with your big idea? And what if because even for mine, I was talking about mine is on the power of visual thinking. If anyone wants to watch my TEDx talk, it's on my website, toddcherches.com. But so the limiting beliefs is like, why me or other people have done something similar before. It's like, how do we get around that? How do we find our big idea that?
Well, the first thing you want to do is get Chris Anderson's book, TED Talks, The Ultimate Guide to Public Speaking. And the next thing you want to do is think about the fact that you don't have to have your talk written. You don't have to have ever spoken on a stage ever in your entire life to actually book a TED Talk. It means you want to understand, and this is directly from his book, gift versus ask, idea versus issue, and knowing that you want the call to action of your talk to be adopting your idea as their own. TED Talks are very specific. It's an art form. So I would suggest learning everything you can about that art form and apply to every event that you can. And also be super conscious about what events you apply to. Make sure that you vet those organizers, because there's a lot of organizers who love TED and they love the brand and they want to do their best, but they have never produced a show in their life. And that is something that you really want to take into consideration, because if you work for 3, 6, 9 months on crafting and perfecting this amazing talk, and you walk out onto that stage completely memorized, your suit is pressed, your dress is perfect, and the lights are bad and the sound is bad, and that video lives on social media and YouTube for the rest of your life, you're going to be really disappointed. So be very clear that you are choosing, and I mean this, you choose the TED event you want to speak at. That means apply to as many as you can, but if you get chosen, audition them just as much as they're auditioning you.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, my TEDx, I had an amazing experience overall, but I don't know if you even know this story, but mine was on visual thinking, and I had 30 slides, quick cuts. Anyway, they said, can you send us the 10 slides that we will edit into your video? Well, guess which one they put up on the screen when I took the stage? The 10 slides instead of my full 30 slide deck. Now, I had a flash drive in my pocket, but because it was such a last minute scramble, we never had a tech run through in the venue. They changed the venue 2 weeks before.
Oh, I know.
I never even stepped on that stage before. We never walked through, even before that day, we had time to run through each slide. And they said, no, there's no time. If we had done that, I would have just taken out my flash drive and I had my backup with me. I had a remote. No one had thought of bringing a remote. So I always have my remote with me. So just those things that an experienced speaker you think of, and yet still I did my TEDx talk. If anyone watches it, it's the slowest I've ever spoken publicly, and it was because I didn't know what the next slide was going to be. So imagine doing a TEDx talk where you literally didn't know what the next slide was going to be. And I had half my brain was presenting and half my brain was editing and coaching myself and keeping from bursting into tears at the same time. So I got off the stage. When I watch it now, I can enjoy it, but my wife was the only one who knew. Everyone else was like, what was the problem? But that was my TEDx experience. So all those tips on your checklist would have really helped me a couple of years ago.
Amazing. Well, that was a heroic performance. I did not know that was going on for you.
Thank you. So in the time we have left, we have about 10 minutes left. Any other questions anyone want to put in the Q&A box? I think we covered all the ones that were already in there. There were a few others that people had submitted in advance. How do you not freeze? How do you deal with, I know a lot of this is preparation and practice, but people talk about mental blocks or freezing or hands shaking or the, I love the analogy of be like a duck on the pond. You know, the ducks glide along the pond, but underneath their little legs are doing this. A lot of times our bodies are, we feel like we're going to throw up, our hearts are pounding through our chest, we're shaking, but people don't see that, right? People, like if you're poised and practiced and prepared, you may be feeling that, but people are not seeing that, but we need to kind of realize that, right?
Nobody knows that you can't remember what's next. Nobody knows that you're very nervous and that you have butterflies in your stomach. No one knows that at all. So a couple things. If you are looking for your words in your mind, there's two ways people do it. You can either look up, I can't remember what I'm saying, and that's exactly what everyone sees you doing, or lower your eyes and then come back. Lower your eyes, see the page, come back and give us the words. If you look up, see how that looks like I can't remember? As opposed to, yeah, I was just thinking something brilliant and now I'm going to share it with you. So that's a really easy tip to do. The other thing is the idea of freezing. Visualization is paramount with having an amazing performance. Just like athletes stand at the free throw line and repeat that action hundreds and thousands of times. They visualize that after they physicalize it. So after you physicalize your experience and memorize that talk and you're doing the blocking and you get in front of people and you work through the physiological response that's happening, the next thing you're going to do, and that's a lot of pre-production, the next thing you're going to do after you've done that fully is start visualizing. And that means sitting quietly with your eyes closed and imagining being called onto the stage, imagining walking onto the stage, imagining delivering the talk, imagining getting your standing ovation, imagining walking off the talk and having everybody hire you, call you, buy your book, all the things. Visualization is going to help you move beyond that fear and that freezing, because you're not going to visualize yourself falling. You're not going to visualize yourself freezing. You're not going to visualize yourself forgetting. So visualizing all of the success sets you up for success ahead of time. So free throw line, repetition, visualization, you getting the ball into the hoop every single time.
I love it. Visual thinking, you're speaking my language, so that's great. Someone asked a question, how much prep time, how do you know how much prep time you need? I mean, that's kind of an it depends kind of thing, right? But it's...
If you struggle with memorization, give yourself a long, long time. I've had speakers who give me panics because they've not memorized 2 weeks before the TED experience. And they promise me, I'll be fine. And then I start getting nervous. If you can literally memorize in 2 weeks because you have a photographic memory, amazing. If you come to my rehearsal and you're not memorized 2 weeks before and you're looking at your script, I'm going to start worrying and I'm going to ask you to put everything on hold and only focus on that 18-minute talk for 2 weeks. So give yourself the truth of knowing I take a really long time to memorize. So I'm going to literally spend a long time memorizing. I did a one-woman show in 2006, I believe, and I booked my theater 9 months out. I wanted to give birth to this show. And that meant hiring an understudy, hiring a director who was my husband, who not my husband at the time, but who's my husband now, hiring a cast, hiring a lighting designer, the costume designer, the yoga teacher, knowing what I needed to eat beforehand. I spent 9 months preparing so that when I did my show, I didn't have to worry about anything. I was in charge. I was in complete command of every single thing that happened. I set myself up for success. Do not give yourself the problem of not being prepared, because that's just irresponsible.
Yeah, that's within our, I mean, that's one of the keys to success in all areas of life is preparation and practice, right? And I love, again, visualizing. Dan Pink, who wrote the book Drive, he talks about doing a pre-mortem. We all know what a post-mortem is. Afterwards, we debrief on what went wrong. A pre-mortem is when you anticipate what could go wrong and then say, what do we do to make sure that does not happen, right? So,
and you know what? Any woman that I know has a bag, a purse that has every single thing that you could possibly need in that purse. It's like MacGyver. So if you are a woman who has every single thing you need in your handbag, do the same thing when it comes to speaking. Pre-mortem, I love it.
Yeah, and I'm that way with I have my presentation toolkit where I have my remote, extra batteries, my timer, so like I'll have 2 remotes. It's like when you do this for a living, you never want to be caught. You always want to have a plan B and C. You want to say, what if the projector goes out, the bulb burns out? What if, I was once doing a workshop at a client for another company and they shipped the wrong manuals. So it's like, I had everyone to open up to page 1. It was like for a different course. So like, what do you do? So, we want to be prepared and over-prepared and anticipate every scenario. And again, things are going to happen, but it's how you deal with it. I think that's, and the more prepared and practiced you are, the more you can, we haven't talked about improv, right? But sometimes we need to improv in the moment and kind of come up with a solution that may not be your ideal, but it works. So in the time we have left, before you leave us with your final thoughts, tell us a little bit about the documentary.
Big Stages is in pre-production right now, and I'm super humbled. Patrick and Kazia Wisnowski reached out to me in early 2020 and said they wanted to feature my work and my speakers in a documentary. And they're part of MG 100. Yes. And they've made a documentary about Marshall Goldsmith. They've made amazing documentaries about thought leaders and people who are having impact in the world. And they approached me because they believe that the work I'm doing with speakers and the transformation that my speakers have in the process with me really does showcase them and the impact that they can have in the world as speakers. And we're in pre-production right now. We're going to start shooting in June here in New York City. And I'm deeply humbled that they want to feature the transformation of my speakers on the big stage. Super excited about it. It's going to be amazing.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Any final thoughts, Tricia, before I close out and hand it back to Maddie?
I'm just super honored to be able to speak with you tonight, Todd, about the influential voice, saying what you mean for lasting legacy. If anybody wants the book, has not yet bought it, they can go to theinfluentialvoicebook.com. And if you purchase it between today and May 7th, you are going to get a bunch of free bonuses like chapter 1 right away, a masterclass on purpose, value, and mission, which is a recorded masterclass. And I'm doing another Meet the Author event in the next couple of weeks that you'll be able to attend for free. So grab a copy of theinfluentialvoicebook.com. And it's just been such a pleasure to talk with you, Todd.
Thank you, Tricia. So as I just said, I was reading the PDF, I ordered the book, it's filled with my notes, everything's underlined, and this is going to be one of my toolkit handbooks that I'm going to keep by my side and refer to everyone I know. So Tricia, it was a pleasure. Tricia had me on her big talk. If you want to hear Tricia and I speaking more, the Big Talk podcast, Tricia interviewed me. So it was a pleasure for me to have the honor to interview you tonight. So Tricia, thank you so much. Thank you to the New York Public Library.
If you desire your copy of The Influential Voice, just hop on over to theinfluentialvoicebook.com and grab your copy today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscription button and notification bell so you get access to all of my latest videos. And please share what your thoughts are in the comments. I look forward to responding to all of you. Big love.